The envelope was already open when I found it on the kitchen counter. My wife's handwriting on the return address. I hadn't opened it. She had. That was the morning I stopped pretending I didn't know. Let me back up. My wife and I had been married for 11 years. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Charlotte. She dropped her paper plate and I handed her mine without thinking. That's the kind of thing you remember when you're sitting in a lawyer's office signing dissolution papers. The small moments that felt like destiny and turned out to just be moments. We had a daughter together. 9 years old, gap-toothed, obsessed with horses and strawberry milk. The kind of kid who draws pictures of her family and hangs them on the refrigerator with 4 magnets, one on each corner, because she wants to make sure they stay. I worked in commercial HVAC. Not glamorous. Long days, dirty hands, driving out to job sites at 6 in the morning with a thermos of bad coffee. My wife worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown. She was good at her job, smart, creative, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately understood its social geometry. I always admired that about her, even when it started to scare me. The changes started about 2 years before that envelope. Small things at first. She started going to the gym more. Not a bad thing. Then the gym became after-work drinks with colleagues. Then the colleagues became a specific colleague. She mentioned him once in passing. Her company had brought in a new account director from their Boston office. She said he was intense, driven. I remember she smiled when she said it. I filed that away and said nothing. Then came the overnight conferences. 2 a year became 4, 4 became 6. She always had documentation, itineraries, hotel receipts she'd show me without me asking, which I eventually realized was the tell. Innocent people don't over-explain. She was managing me. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I want to be clear about that. I grew up watching my father treat my mother like she was something he'd already decided to get rid of, always looking for an exit, always half checked out. I promised myself I'd be different. I'd lead with trust, so when my gut started sending signals, I argued with it for a long time. The GPS app changed things. It wasn't surveillance. Not at first. We'd set up location sharing 2 years prior when my daughter started taking the school bus, so we could both see where she was. One evening, I was checking to make sure she'd gotten to my mother-in-law's house after school, and I accidentally pulled up my wife's location instead. She was supposed to be at a work event in Raleigh. Her dot was sitting still in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. Residential. Not a hotel. Not a conference center. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't confront her. I know that sounds weak. People always ask why you don't just confront them right away. And the honest answer is that confrontation without evidence is just an accusation, and an accusation gives the other person the chance to build a better lie. I'd watched enough friends get gaslighted into thinking they were crazy to know that wasn't the road I wanted to take. So I watched, and I waited. Over the next 3 months, I documented everything quietly, not obsessively. I still went to work, still coached my daughter's soccer team on Saturday mornings, still had dinner on the table when my wife got home because that's what I did. But I started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before. The account director from Boston had relocated permanently. I found that out through a friend who worked at the same company. His name didn't matter to me then, and it doesn't matter to me now. What mattered was the pattern. The way her work schedule shifted to match his. The way she started keeping her phone face down. The way she began sleeping on her side of the bed like there was a line drawn down the middle that neither of us acknowledged. The envelope I found that morning was from a hotel in Asheville. A receipt, it turned out. She'd been using a credit card I didn't know about. An old account she'd never closed from before we were married. She must have left it out by accident. The receipt was for 2 nights. The dates lined up with a weekend she told me she was visiting her college roommate in Savannah. I took a photo of the receipt, put it back exactly where I found it. That same week, I called an attorney. Not to start anything, just to understand my options. My attorney was methodical and calm, the kind of person who'd clearly heard every version of this story and didn't need to perform sympathy. She walked me through what documentation would matter, what wouldn't, and what I needed to think about in terms of my daughter. Custody, school district, financial assets. I want to be honest, there was a version of me that wanted to blow everything up immediately. Show up at his office. Make a scene. Post something. The rage was there, it was real, but every time I felt it rising, I thought about my daughter sitting in the back seat of my truck on Saturday mornings, telling me about the horses she'd learned about at school, and I knew I had to be smart. She didn't deserve a war. She deserved a father who kept his head. So I kept going. Another month. My wife's company held an annual spring gala. It was a big deal. Clients, partners, local press sometimes. Formal dress, open bar, held at a hotel ballroom downtown. My wife had been on the planning committee. She was excited about it in a way that felt performative, like she was practicing excitement for an audience. She asked me to come. I said yes. I want you to understand what that evening looked like from the outside. I wore my good suit. I got a haircut. I drove us there in the car we bought together 3 years ago, and I held the door open for her because that's what I've always done. We walked into that ballroom, and she introduced me to colleagues as her husband, and I shook hands and made small talk and drank one glass of sparkling water. He was there. Of course he was. I'd seen photos online, so I knew what he looked like. Tall, well-dressed, the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to work for a parking spot. He shook my hand when we were introduced, looked me in the eye, said it was great to finally meet me. My wife smiled and touched my arm. I smiled back at both of them. What neither of them knew was that 2 days before the gala, I had finalized everything with my attorney. The filing was ready. The documentation was organized. The conversation I was about to have had been prepared, reviewed, and timed. I waited until about an hour into the event. My wife was across the room talking to someone from her team. I walked over to him, just the two of us near the bar. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't make a scene. I didn't threaten him or call him names. I simply said, calmly and quietly, that I knew, that I had documentation, that papers would be filed Monday morning, and that I wanted him to understand, before this became public in any way, that I was doing this for my daughter, not for him, not for my wife, not for any dramatic satisfaction, for my daughter, so that the process would be as clean and orderly as possible. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said he was sorry. I nodded and went back across the room. My wife found me 20 minutes later with a look on her face I hadn't seen before. Something had shifted in his expression after I'd walked away, I imagine, and she'd noticed. She pulled me toward a quieter corner near the coat check. She asked what I'd said to him. I told her I'd introduced myself. She searched my face for a long time. I've spent 11 years learning the landscape of that face, and I know she was trying to read something in mine. I kept it neutral. We drove home mostly in silence. She asked once if everything was okay. I said yes. On Monday morning, after I dropped my daughter at school, hugged her at the door, told her I loved her, watched her run inside with her backpack bouncing, I called my attorney and confirmed the filing. My wife was served that afternoon. She called me 6 times. I let them go to voicemail. When I finally called her back that evening, she was crying, and I let her talk. And when she was done, I told her that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't trying to punish her, that I just needed us to move through this in a way that protected our daughter. She said she'd made a terrible mistake. She said it didn't mean anything. She asked if we could talk to someone, a counselor, if there was any way. I told her I'd been ready to have that conversation for a long time. That conversation was no longer available. The next 6 months were the hardest of my life, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Telling my daughter was the single most difficult thing I have ever done. We sat at the kitchen table, just the two of us, because my wife and I had agreed to do it separately and then together, and I tried to explain that her mom and I were going to live in different houses and that none of it was her fault. She cried. I held it together until she fell asleep that night, and then I sat in the driveway in my truck for about 45 minutes. The process was not clean, despite my best intentions. There were disagreements about the house. There were long email chains and conference calls with attorneys, and one meeting that my wife left early. There was a period of about 6 weeks where my daughter started wetting the bed again, which she hadn't done since she was 4, and I drove her to a child therapist twice a week without complaint, because that's what you do. What I will say is this: I got custody, primary physical, joint legal. My daughter lives with me during the week. My wife has her on weekends and alternating holidays. My attorney was right. The documentation mattered. It wasn't about punishing my wife. It was about demonstrating stability, consistency, the kind of environment my daughter had already been living in without my wife's help. The account director, I heard through the mutual friend, transferred back to Boston within 3 months of the gala. I didn't ask for details. My wife and I are cordial now. We have to be, for our daughter. She picks her up on Friday afternoons, and I have her back by Sunday evening, and we exchange information about homework and soccer schedules, and one time last fall she said thank you, without context, and I said you're welcome, and that was the whole conversation. I don't live in the house we shared. I bought a place on the other side of town. Smaller, older, needs work. I've been doing most of it myself on weekends, which is satisfying in the way that physical work always is. My daughter has the bigger bedroom. She picked the paint color herself. She chose a shade called Morning Mist, which looked gray on the swatch but turned out closer to lavender in the afternoon light. She loves it. The thing she loves most, though, is the shed out back. I'm not handy with woodworking the way some guys are, but I've been learning. YouTube tutorials, a couple of books, some patient advice from an older man down the street who built furniture for 50 years and doesn't mind teaching. My daughter started coming out there with me on Saturday mornings after soccer. She hands me tools she doesn't know the names of yet and asks questions I don't always have answers for, and tells me about school while I sand things. Last month, she carved her initials into the workbench with a nail. I found them when I was cleaning up one afternoon. 3 letters in the wood, a little uneven, pressed in deep. I didn't sand them out. Some things you leave exactly where they are. I still think about that kitchen counter sometimes. The envelope sitting there, already open, her handwriting on it. Such a small thing. A receipt she forgot to hide. 11 years of marriage, and it ended not with a confession or a confrontation, but with a piece of paper left in the wrong place at the wrong time. People want betrayal to make sense. They want there to be a reason. You work too much. You grew apart. Something broke down that could have been fixed. Maybe some of that was true. I've sat with it long enough to stop needing a clean answer. What I do know is this. The way things end tells you everything about the choices people made along the way. My wife made hers over a long stretch of time, in small decisions that compounded. I made mine too. The decision to stay quiet, stay clear-headed, stay focused on what actually mattered. That wasn't passivity. I want to be honest about that because I think men in these situations get told 2 things. Either blow it up immediately or forgive everything. I didn't do either. I did something harder. I thought carefully about consequences before I acted, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that the way I handled the next few months would shape my daughter's life in ways she'd carry long after she stopped drawing family portraits with 4 magnets on each corner. That kind of thinking, slow, deliberate, eyes open, doesn't come naturally when you're in pain. You have to build it. I'd spent years watching my father react first and think never, and I'd made a quiet promise to myself to be different. Keeping that promise when everything in me wanted to burn something down was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the thing I'm most proud of. There's something I've come to believe about how life actually works, separate from luck or fairness or anything you can't control. Character creates outcomes over time, not instantly, not cleanly, but consistently. My wife's choices, the lies, the compartmentalizing, the long performance of a marriage she'd already mentally left. Those didn't just hurt me. They unraveled her own position in every room that mattered. The custody arrangement, the house, the way our mutual friends eventually sorted themselves out. I didn't engineer any of that. I just refused to become someone I'd be ashamed of, and the rest followed. My daughter carved her initials into my workbench last month. 3 uneven letters pressed into the wood. I found them while cleaning up on a Saturday afternoon. Sawdust on my hands, the radio playing something low in the background. I didn't sand them out. That's the whole thing right there. You go through something that tries to take everything from you, and if you hold on to who you are, if you keep showing up with some basic decency, some steadiness, some willingness to do the unglamorous work of rebuilding, you end up with something real. Not perfect, not what you planned, but real and yours and worth keeping. The initials stay.